Hi, Caroline here. We're in my home sewing room today, and I'm so excited because we are going to be sewing the Carrie Crop top together. Here she is. This is our newest release from BF Patterns, and this t-shirt has become a wardrobe staple for me. I wear it all the time. As you can see, I have many versions, and I love it so much. Y'all know I love a quick project. I love sewing with knits, and I'm really excited to take you on this journey today. I'm going to give you lots of tips. If it's your first time sewing with knits, don't be intimidated. It is a really quick sew. It's a great palette cleanser. It is infinitely hackable. We're definitely going to be sharing some hacks with you. Today we're just going to be making the basic out-of-the-box version of the Carrie crop top together, and it's going to be super fun because at the end of the day we're going to end up with a new crop top that we can wear again and again. Let's get into it. Okay, let's talk fabric for a quick sec. The main sample I'm going to be making today is going to be out of our medium weight bamboo rib knit. This fabric was kind of what we had in mind when we designed this pattern. We wanted a crop top that would work really well in a rib knit. I'm actually wearing one right now. So this fabric is perfect. You're looking for something with a 60% widthwise and 50% lengthwise stretch, and we will do another video where we show you how to calculate stretch percentage, but there's instructions in our booklet as well for that. So the bamboo rib knit works really well for this. I also think our cotton Modal jersey knit is a perfect choice. I'm going to be showing you a couple of techniques on this fabric as well. In terms of other fabrics from our store that I think would work, I brought a few to show you. The wide rib knit is perfect. Any kind of stable rib knit. When we say stable, we mean look for something that has good stretch, good recovery, something a little bit substantial that's not going to stretch out or that is just going to feel too light or delicate. So our wide rib knit works really well for this pattern as well. You could also go with something like a basic bamboo jersey, which is super, super soft and a little bit more slinky, but would also make a great fabric for like a layering piece. Our unwind bamboo cotton rib knit would also work really well for this pattern. It's maybe has a tiny bit less recovery than the medium weight bamboo rib knit, but I think it would still work really well. You might end up with just an ever so slightly looser fit, which is definitely not a bad thing. And then the cotton jersey knit I think would also work well. We did make a sample in this fabric, which I think we'll put a picture of on the screen, but the cotton jersey knit would work really well. It might be a little bit more compressive, so you can size up, but it would still be really great, and I love this fabric. It's a really nice basic cotton spandex jersey knit. Okay, so grab your fabric and we're gonna get our materials together and get into cutting. All right, so I'm just prepping my pattern here, cutting out my pieces. I will be making the size 2XL in range 2, and I'm actually going to be sewing up both views because I want to show you some different techniques today. At this point, you should also have pre-washed your fabric. If it's super wrinkly, you're probably going to want to iron it so that it's nice and smooth for cutting out. And just remember, pre-washing is doing yourself a favor for later. Pre-washing is going to help you to prevent your finished garment from shrinking. So it is important to do this unless you're confident that your fabric isn't going to shrink. Okay, so what you see here is my favorite way to cut at home. I am referring to our cutting layout, but I'm actually cutting in stages so that I can cut all of my pieces on my cutting mat. And I just use pattern weights and a rotary cutter for this. I am using hockey pucks as pattern weights, as you can see, but you can use literally so many household items for this: cans, cutlery, heavy duty washers from the hardware store. Just get creative, use what you have. It is important to pay attention to grain line when you're cutting out your pieces. If your pattern piece is cut on fold, as mine is here, that fold line should be parallel to the grain line. And this is pretty easy with rib knits because the ribs actually run along the grain line. Once I've finished cutting out my piece, you're going to see me snipping into my notches. Just make sure that you keep that snip within the seam allowance. So I'm only cutting about 1/4 inch here since our seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch. And I like to do this as I go along so I don't forget. And then when I go to sew, I can't find my notches and I have to pull out my pieces. Just do it right away. I'm going to give you some quick tips as well. So my biggest tip is making sure that your fabric is not falling off the edge of the table. Because knits are stretchy, this can stretch out your fabric and it's going to result in inaccurate cutting. So I like to keep all my fabric scrunched to the side on the table or cut it into smaller pieces and just smooth out the section that I am working with. And anytime you're cutting any fabric, use a sharp blade, whether it's a rotary cutter or scissors. I like using a rotary cutter. I like to keep backup blades on hand for my rotary cutter so that I can swap that out if it feels dull. You shouldn't have to press hard with your rotary cutter, so change that out. And by the way, I actually decided to do our short sleeve view after cutting this, so that's why you'll see a short sleeve later in this green fabric. And for this neckband piece, it's just cut one, so you can cut it on a single layer. It's a great way to use up scraps from cutting. Just about ready to get into sewing. I have all my materials gathered here. My green sample is going to be sewn completely on my regular sewing machine and the brown one on my serger for the most part. So grab your pieces, grab your matching thread. You're also going to want a ballpoint or jersey or knit needle. You can optionally use a twin needle for your hems. I'll show you that technique at the end here. And then you may want some shoulder stabilizer if your fabric isn't super stable and you're worried about it stretching out. I'm just using 1/4 inch black elastic here, but my preference is clear elastic. Again, just use what you have. The first thing I like to do when I'm starting a new project is just to set up my machine and do a quick test sew on the fabric I'm going to be using. So for this pattern, if you're constructing this on your regular sewing machine like me, we recommend a zigzag stitch about 1.5 wide and 2 long. And I have some scraps here that I'm just going to sew and see how the fabric looks along that seam line. I'm looking for something that stretches nicely without my stitches popping. And I also want my seam to lay flat and not look stretched out and wavy. So you can play around with your stitch length, your width, your tension, and even your presser foot pressure until you get your seam to look good. This looks really nice to me, and I think we're ready to get started. So let's go. So we're starting off with attaching the shoulder edges together. So with the right sides of your fabric together, you're going to match those shoulder edges of your front piece 1 and back piece 2. And you can pin this in place. I love using Wonder Clips on knits because then I'm just not worried about pins making holes in my knit fabric. So go ahead and sew those shoulder seams at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then we will go straight over to our iron and iron those seams towards the back of the garment. Now you may want to stabilize the shoulders of your top because this can help to maintain the shape of the shoulders over time. So measure out 2 pieces of elastic that are the length of the shoulder seam. I actually sewed my shoulders on my regular machine first at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance because this is going to give me extra control since I'm not trying to sew the seam and secure the elastic all at once. So once you have your shoulders sewn together, you can pin your elastic to the back shoulder seam allowance and keep that elastic close to your seam but not directly on top of it to avoid bulk. So now I'm at my serger, I'm securing this elastic in place, and I'm trimming my seam allowance as I go. Sergers usually sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So for all of construction on this brown sample, you're going to see me trimming off 1/8 of an inch as I sew because the pattern seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch. Okay, let's get started on our neckline. So we're starting off with a binding finish here. With right sides of the neck binding together, we're matching those short ends, and then we're going to sew along this short edge and press this seam open. Okay, this might feel a little mind bendy, but just trust me here. With the right side of your neck binding on the wrong side,
of your body pieces, you're going to line up the raw edges together. So line up that raw edge of your binding with the raw edge of the neckline. The seam that you just sewed in the binding should line up with the center back, and then you can match the notches to the shoulder seams and the center front and place pins at these points. Just remember the circumference of the binding is slightly smaller than the neckline, so don't worry if it looks slightly gathered at this stage. This is just going to ensure that the binding lays flat once it's sewn up. All right, over to our machine. Starting at the center back, sew the binding in place. You're still using that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. You're going to need to gently stretch the binding as you sew so that it sort of fits your neckline. Just be careful not to stretch the neckline. So you can see I'm using one hand to stretch the band and the other one to sort of guide my fabric through. Take your time here. Make sure that your fabric isn't scrunched or folded up underneath. And you'll also notice when I sew over my shoulder seam there, I'm just making sure that the shoulder seam allowance is still facing the back of the garment. All right, here's where the magic happens. I just love this binding finish. I think it looks so professional. It really gives like a ready-to-wear look, especially on rib knit fabrics. So I am excited. Okay, the first thing I'm doing here is folding the raw edge in. I'm sort of flipping that binding up and over the neckline towards the right side of the neckline, and that raw edge gets folded under so that it's tucked in nice and snugly. And you can pin that folded edge to the right side of your body pieces or use wonder clips. Just go around and secure it in place. Take your time and use as many pins as you need here. Ooh, we're almost on our neckline. Okay, we are now going to edge stitch the binding in place using a zigzag stitch. So this is securing everything and it's going to give it a really nice professional look. So from the right side of the garment, I'm edge stitching 1/8 of an inch in from the folded edge, and I'm really taking my time here to try to get that stitch line nice and straight and even, because that's going to make all the difference in the finished look of the garment. I am so happy we're getting this neckline out of the way here. I love getting it done right off the bat because everything after this is so quick and easy. So great job, you're doing it. All right, I'm gonna demo the band finish now. So with the wrong sides of the fabric together, you're folding this neckband piece in half lengthwise and pressing. And I'm not gonna show the next step, but you're just gonna do what I did previously. So you'll unfold this neckband piece, and then with the right sides of the fabric together, you'll match those short ends of the piece and sew along that edge and then press that seam open. And then you can actually fold it in half lengthwise again, wrong sides together, so you sort of end up with this circular neckband piece that's pre-folded. And then with the right sides of the fabric together, you're going to align the raw edges of the neckband with the raw edge of the neckline. And the seam of the band that you just sewed up should line up with the center back, and just match your notches to the shoulder seams and the center front, and you can place pins or wonder clips at these points and just go around and use as many pins as you need. And remember, the circumference of the band is smaller than the neckline, so don't worry if it looks slightly gathered at this stage. This is just going to ensure that that band is going to stretch and lay flat once you sew it up. All right, and I'm sewing this on my serger, so remember I'm going to be trimming off 1/8 of an inch seam allowance as I sew. So starting at the center back, you're going to sew that band in place and gently stretch the band as you sew so that it fits your neckline. Just be careful not to stretch the neckline. So I'm using one hand to stretch the band and the other to kind of guide the fabric through, and especially if you're working with a serger, really take your time here because it is cutting as it's sewing and sometimes there's no undo button. So just take your time. And of course, the band finish can also be sewn completely on your regular sewing machine. So you would just be doing that at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and it's still gonna look really good. Okay, and here I am at my ironing board, and this is when you can really get that nice professional look with a neckband. So I'm gently pressing that band up towards the neckline, and I like to use a little bit of steam to slightly shrink in the band if needed, and I'm taking my time. I'm going around. I like to use my tailor's ham here just to give me a little bit more control and be able to isolate the area that I'm trying to press. And this is going to give it a really nice finish. All right, now we are attaching the sleeves. So with the right sides of the fabric together, I am aligning my notches on the sleeves. This is piece 5 with the notches on the armhole and with the shoulder seam as well. So go around and align those notches and pin them in place. Okay, and now we are going to just sew the sleeves in place. So go along that shoulder seam, make sure that you're lining up your raw edges and your notches as you sew, and just sew along that seam. When you get to the shoulder seam, just make sure that that seam allowance is facing towards the back. And once you finish sewing up your shoulder seams, you can take them over to your ironing board and press that seam allowance towards the sleeve. Our next step is going to be assembling our side seams, but first, to prepare for an easier hem, we're going to pre-press the hem of our sleeves and the hem of our bodice. So go ahead and do that. You're folding that up to the wrong side by about 5/8 of an inch hem allowance. And this is just going to make it easier to fold up that hem later when you're ready to stitch your hem. You don't have to go over to the ironing board and do that in the round. It's just much easier at this stage. So let's get that done. And then with the right sides of the fabric together, we're going to match up our side seams and underarm edges of the front and back pieces. So you can pin these raw edges together. You don't really have to use pins here. This is a pretty easy seam to sew, but if you want a little bit of extra security, go ahead and pin that in place. And then we are sewing this edge together. So we're using that 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I like to sew from the underarm to the hem. And here's a tip. You'll notice when I'm sewing that underarm seam, I like to push the two seam allowances in different directions. This just reduces the underarm bulk and makes it easier to run through my machine. And I don't find it really has an impact on the look of the final garment. It's sort of tucked away under your arm, but it just makes for a much easier sewing experience and I think a more professional look. And the same goes if you are constructing this garment on your serger. You can stagger that underarm seam allowance to reduce bulk, and just remember to trim off that 1/8 of an inch seam allowance as you sew so that your seam is accurate. We're at the final step. This is so exciting. Okay, you can go ahead and pin your hem in place at 5/8 of an inch. I didn't do that here. I love pre-pressing my hems for this reason. It just makes it really easy to jump right into hemming. So I'm top stitching my hem in place 1/2 inch from the folded edge. And on this green t-shirt, I'm just hemming with a zigzag finish, which I think looks totally great. But if you want to try out a twin needle, I'm going to show you how to do that next. So for the twin needle finish, you're going to need obviously a twin needle, and then you'll need 2 spools of thread and your bobbin threaded with the same color of thread. If you don't have 2 spools of matching thread, you can also just thread a second bobbin. And this is going to sound counterintuitive, it's going to seem wrong, but you are going to basically thread your sewing machine twice. So often sewing machines have 2 spots where you can place a thread spool. So go ahead and find that second spot and thread your sewing machine twice, and each of those 2 threads are going to go through the 2 eyes of the twin needle. And then you are going to put your bobbin in, and you're just sewing with a straight stitch here, and I promise you it's going to work. So get all of that threaded up and ready to go. Do a little test sew on your sewing machine. You might need to lower your thread tension to get a nice sort of smooth flat finish here. And it's just 2 stitch lines on the front side, and it looks kind of like a zigzag on the back side, and it's really nice and stretchy. So once that looks good, you can go ahead and sew up your hems just as you would with a zigzag or a straight stitch, but it is this magical twin needle double stitch that gives you a really nice professional ready to wear look. And if you've never tried this before, give it a go, pick up a twin needle and try it out. It's super easy and I think you're gonna love it. Woo, we're all done. Here is view A of the Carrie crop top with the beautiful binding neckline finish. I just love it in this fabric. And here's view B with the neck band finish and my lovely stretchy twin needle hems. Thanks so much everyone for following along. I had a ton of fun. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon.